If you're just learning a new opening, I bet that you feel overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information out there. There are so many publications, books, and opening lines. Opening theory has advanced so much that it is a pretty daunting task to take up. But today we're going to take a look at what you should do before you dive into the opening theory and go through the many variations that you're going to face. First, you need to understand the ideas behind your opening. So we're going to take a look at an approach to do exactly that. Let's dive in. To really understand the openings that you play, you can't ignore the classics. It makes absolutely no sense to study the many variations of the King's Indian defense when you don't even know Bronstein's games. You do need to know the games of the players of the past in the openings that you play. And this is extremely important. In those games, you get exposed to the ideas that, were the foundation of the very opening. And they usually played against opponents who weren't that strong. So the ideas don't just lie in the background, they were actually applied during the games, which is something that you don't really get in games of modern grandmasters. So the approach that we're going to take is what I like to call the historical approach. When you want to learn a new opening, you'd better check out the games from the players of the past. For example, let's say you're going to play the Nimzo Indian. It makes absolutely no sense to go through the many lines if you don't know Nimzowicz's games themselves. I mean, you do need to know Aaron Nimzowicz's work on this. And let's take a quick look to see how you can work in this respect. What I like to do is create a database with the games that I'm encountering and make comments on them and try to learn at least a couple of things about the game that you go through. Let's take a look at this game first. It's Mattison versus Nimzowitsch. This is an absolute classic where Nimzowitsch really shows how to handle the structure. It was d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. This is the start of the Nimzo Indian, which is an approach that was quite a bit of a novelty in the sense that black didn't play d5 to control the center with pawns, stopping e4. He's going to stop e4 by indirect means. In this case, by pinning the knight on c3. So if e4, we'll just take that pawn. The knight on c3 is pinned. And after knight f3, Nimzowitsch used to take here. And you're going to say, this is really outdated. People don't take without white playing h3. But this is still relevant because we're going to see how Nimzowitsch used to handle this structure. Even though it's not modern theory, it inspired some important lines within the Nimzo Indian, even the Hübner variation, where black takes without being provoked. Though admittedly, black usually doesn't. The Hübner variation goes c5, e3, knight c6, bishop d3. And now black takes on c3 without being provoked by a3. Granted, bishop takes c3 might be a bit premature on move 4 as Nimzowitsch plays here, but you see, Nimzowitsch ideas inspired modern variations too. And this is the typical double pawns in the Nimzo Indian. And after giving up the dark square bishop, Nimzowitsch contended that to replace it, and in order not to acquire weaknesses on the dark squares, because we're missing that bishop, we're going to put all the pawns on dark squares. This was the idea. These seats, and then maybe knight b7 or queen e7 to support e5, and even c5 at some point. Now, white takes upon himself to dominate the center then. Queen c2, he wants to play e4 most likely. Queen e7, supporting e5 and c5. And white makes a very instructive mistake. He plays bishop a3 here, which is a terrible move. The idea, of course, was to stop e5 altogether, because e5 now just lose the pawn after d takes e, and we can't take back because the queen will be hanging. So e5 has been stopped, but bishop e3 is normally a very bad mistake in the Nimzo. The problem is that the bishop ends up biting granite after c5, which is a very common move to restrict the pawns, the double pawns. At the same time, what black is doing is just shutting this bishop off. And by the way, this is exactly the same structure what black wanted. All the pawns on dark squares, e5 is going to happen very soon. b6. He's going to have a real fortress on dark squares, making this bishop look very good at the same time. The bishop on c8 is going to go to b7 or a6 to attack the pawn on c4. And the problems start to appear for white. And the problem of the double pawns is that they are very easily restricted. Because they can't support each other to advance forwards, it's very easy to fix them on the squares where they are, and then in the future probably attack them. If this pawn or this pawn were on the b file, then it will be easy to play b3 and defend the c4 pawn, or maybe even advance together. But with these two pawns being on the c file, and that's one of the problems of the double pawns, is that they're really easy to fit and restrict. They can't really move forwards. And white completely misses the plot here and loses the plot here, and he plays g3, which is not a great idea. This bishop would be needed here to defend the c4 pawn, and it's going to become obvious after a few moves. b6, very good, just consolidating c5 and enabling bishop b7. In fact, after bishop g2, bishop b7, now the bishop on g2 is neutralized, and c4 is going to suffer just in a few moves. It's interesting that white didn't seem to do anything so wrong, and he has a terrible position here because he just didn't understand the positional risk. And the positional risk is that this pawn will be very badly exposed. Black has many typical maneuvers to attack it. For example, knight a6, knight a5, and in the future bishop a6. And the pawn is heavily pressed by all of black's pieces, even rook c8, that would in the future just probably threaten c takes d4, opening the c file to attack the pawn on c4. And white can't do much about this at this point. Normally what he does is he tries to take up space in the center by advancing the central pawns, but now even that is highly unlikely. White just castle, black castle, and white's strategy is still flawed. He changes the light square bishops. He was in trouble, but this isn't doing him any favors. After bishop takes g2, he took with the king. He probably wanted to go back to f3 with the knight, even though the knight there is not particularly good. He might have been better off taking with the knight, going to e3 to defend c4, but it's still uncomfortable. And now a very instructive maneuver. Nimzowitsch plays queen b7 check. And after king to g1, the queen was actually going to a6 to put pressure on c4. And the pawn starts to suffer. I mean, this is a blueprint of how things can really go south for white. Without the light square bishop, it's very hard to defend c4. And the pressure is really easy for black. Knight c6, knight a5, a rook to c8, and c4 is probably going to collapse, just like that. So white plays queen b3, attempting to keep the pawn on c4 alive, because, well, he has a tactical idea to do so. But the queen on b3 and the bishop on a3 are normally very badly placed. And if there's something to learn about this game, is that bishop a3, if we can just put all the pawns on dark squares, it's completely useless. And it's a very common mistake, actually. I've seen it happen many times. And also that the queen on b3 is easily exposed to a knight a5. And in this case, white still has a trick on queen b5. He's not losing the pawn. In fact, after rook fd1, defending d4, black just went knight a5, attacking the queen on b3, attacking the pawn on c4, but white has queen b5, which, well, enables him to keep the pawn alive. After queen takes b5, there's c takes b5, and white hasn't lost the pawn. And he also got rid of the double pawn, so it seems that he's more or less off the hook. But here's another big lesson about the Nimzo-Indian. The disappearance of those double pawns doesn't mean that white is completely off the hook positionally speaking. Because when those pawns disappear, sometimes they leave very weak squares in their place. And it's exactly the case here. White lacks the light square bishop. And he still has a hole there on c4, and black takes advantage of that immediately, putting a knight on c4. After bishop c1, there's no kicking this knight out of there. It's a big problem because it's a huge piece. White's control of the light squares is quite problematic. The knight could jump to e4 or d5 at any point. And black plays a very good move here to increase the pressure. A6. A6 because he's going to open the a file to attack the isolated pawn on a2. And we could argue, hey, he has an isolated pawn on b6 too. Well, more of a backward pawn after b takes, rook takes. You could say, well, white can attack the pawn on the b file too, but the knight on c4 is denying everything. That knight is a monster. It defends b6, d6. It can't be kicked out. There are no pawns for white to push that knight away. So white is positionally lost here, and it's that bad. D takes c, b takes c5, keeping all the pawns in one big, large mass. And white's pawns are kind of all over the place, and these two islands are very attackable, especially the pawn on a2. So knight g2, intending to exchange the knights, but black plays very well. Knight d5, keeping this one on c4 at all times. And attacking c3, of course. After rook d3, white's intention is probably to kick this knight back. But it has a flaw, and there's really no way of defending everything at this point. These two are just too weak, and the knight on c4 is just exploiting the weakness of the light squares very easily. So after rook fa8, this pawn is falling, and white intended to go e4, of course, to try to create something here. But after knight e5, white just resigned. He's losing something, and this is a very nice move, attacking the rook instead of just getting the knight out of there. And after rook moves somewhere, white starts dropping material left and right. Rook d2, even this check is very strong. It's a fork. There are not many places for the rook really. After rook to d1, there is knight takes e3. That's another pawn that falls. The a2 pawn is going to fall too. That is if white can save the rook somehow, because if he goes to any of these squares, there's always a fork. So it's a complete disaster. After, say, rook f1, rook takes a2, white can definitely resign. Down 2 pawns, and black is completely dominating here. So what can we learn from this game? And there are many things to take out from this game. One of them is the general strategy from black. After the exchange and giving white the double pawns, he puts every pawn on a dark square to replace the bishop and to make his remaining bishop look good, and at the same time restricting his opponent's bishops. And then, well, we saw some typical mistakes by white, like putting the bishop on a3, intending to play c5. Sometimes white gets his way, but normally the bishop is just staring at the brick wall on a3, and it's very, very badly placed. At the same time, we also saw some typical maneuvers like the bishop a6, or in this case it was a queen a6, knight c6, knight a5 to attack c4. And also something a little bit more subtle, the fact that the disappearance of the double pawns doesn't necessarily mean, here I'm trying to get to that point after queen b5, the disappearance of the double pawns doesn't mean that the problems are over. Sometimes the pawn on c3 is still a problem on the semi-open file after c takes d, for example, or it's just a problem that the light squares end up being very, very weak, and black can occupy c4 as it happened in the game. So this is a very important classical game that if you don't know this game, you probably should if you're going to play the Nimzo-Indian, for example. And these things repeat themselves throughout many games. In this case, Nimzowitsch played against Bogoljubov. Let's take a quick look at this. Same system where Nimzowitsch takes very early on c3, and after b takes c3, b cedes. Same approach, pawns to dark squares. G3, same mistake. I mean, the pawn just doesn't belong on G3. He should play E3, the bishop to D3, castle, and knight E2, E4. Try to advance the central pawns. And this is a pretty typical, misconception, we could call it. They both castle, and black plays rook E8, which is a nice prophylactic measure because the idea is just to play d6 e5. So e4 is going to be very hard to achieve because after some d takes e4, the pawn e4 would be under a lot of pressure. So that kind of discourages the plan of carrying out e4. And white still goes for it. After d cedes, queen c2, he's clearly intending e4, and e5 would be fine, but this move is also very instructive because it's a very typical resource. In the Nimzo Indian, in the Queen's Indian, we put the bishop on e4, we restrict e4 by physically putting a piece there, attacking the queen. If the knight ever moves, we're just going to exchange the light square bishop, which we know is good for us. Then c4 is very hard to protect. And white even goes queen b3, which we already know the queen is kind of exposed on that square to some knight a5. It's not a great square for the queen, really. So what does Nimzowitsch play here? Clearly, knight c6. Knight c6, and there are going to be some problems with this pawn right away. So bishop f1 is what Bogoljubov had in mind. And now e5, which already threatens to take, and then pawn takes on d4, winning a pawn, and this is extremely uncomfortable now. If d5, this pawn is weak forever, and this d5 is a reaction you really like to see in this position, because you haven't even played c5, and you have c5 for a knight. So for example, you can play knight a5, and if the queen goes, say, to b4, you can reroute this knight to c5, or you can even go knight d7, knight c5, and you have beautiful square on top of the weakness of the double pawns that are very restricted. You also have c5 for the knight. And actually, since you haven't played c5, the position is not quite closed on the queen side. You can play rook c8 and break on c6, and the rook will have a very hard look on those pawns that are going to be very clear targets. So yeah, white doesn't want to play d5, which is also very typical. I mean, normally in these setups, white waits until black plays c5 to play d5. There's another famous game by Nimzowitsch that is exactly about that. He tries to provoke d5 before playing c5, and without it, and white resists. White doesn't really want to push there. But Bogoljubov made a similarly bad move. He plays d takes c5, which basically breaks up his structure. Now he has these double and isolated pawns that long-term are really bad weaknesses. Even though they are not on an open file, there's a pawn on c7, and they are harder to attack because of that. The problem is that they are permanently fixed. They really showcase what the problem is with those double pawns. They can never march forwards, so it's really easy for them to become targets, especially as more and more pieces are traded and white gets deprived of counterplay. So after some trades, it was pretty clear that Bogoljubov was just struggling here. f3, the bishop went back. Well, the rest of the game is very very typical of how to exploit these long-term weaknesses. In this case, the knight is heading to c5, of course, because there's a big outpost there, as there are no d or b pawns. The square in front of the weak pawns is always weak, and we can use it as an outpost. So e4, queen f6, bishop g2, and there's a little blemish here with knight e5, and this is a useful resource to take a look at c5, because the bishop is hanging on b7, so b takes c, just hang the bishop. And if d takes c, after bishop takes e5, the rook invades on the 7th rank, and even though black is up a pawn, well, white now has some compensation. He might start pushing the majority in the center. The rook on the 7th rank is really annoying. Now we have to defend this, probably by playing some move like rook f8. So it's not really what black was looking for. But they both missed this opportunity for some moves. And it was just a matter of black playing bishop c6 instead, and he'll be completely fine. Both missed this for some time, and now, only now, he plays bishop c6 and is off the hook. So, well, there was some maneuvering involved. White's structure on the king side is very weak, especially with that pawn on g3. So, black's plan now is going to be to play f5, because he has a ton of pressure on f3, and he really wants this bishop to have that diagonal open for it. But there's no rush, and we can make some preparation moves, get the king out of the way, of course, so there are no funny business with c5. Queen a3, queen e6, the pawn is really not free to take because rook a8 is coming. Queen c1, f5, and white collapsed pretty quickly here. Creating a second weakness essentially. This is very weak as it is, but now we're getting some play on the king side too. And after pawn takes, queen d2, queen f7 attacking the pawn on c4, queen d4 to defend it, knight g6 with a double attack on f4 and e2. And well, white collapses because now he has to allow another set of double pawns, and that looks absolutely ridiculous. Of course, the endgame is just completely losing. One of the pawns dropped, and well, they continued for some moves, but this is clearly completely losing for white. And well, after some exchanges, black is up 2 pawns, and it was a rather easy win. So in the two games, we got some very, very similar ideas showcased. The bishop on a3 was completely out of play. The weakness of the pawn on c4 is very obvious. D takes e5 was a very bad position mistake by Bogoljubov. But in the opening, we also saw that plan with g3, bishop g2 with the double pawns. Well, the problem is that c4 gets exposed very, very easily. So the historical approach involves looking at these games that seem rather simple, but you need to know the ideas, and these games really show them in a very raw, very clear way. Of course, against the Nimzo-Indian, and other attempts appear, because you can imagine Nimzowitsch came up with this system. It's changing the dark square bishop to double up the opponent's pawns, and then he'll systematically crush them, just restricting them. But of course, some other tries appeared. And let's take a look at other ideas that appeared against the Nimzo-Indian. And of course, you need to know. But here we're going to take a look at Rubinstein versus Nimzowitsch, and how this approach can easily fail if you don't adapt. Some players started to avoid the double pawns. I mean, the influence of Nimzowitsch was so great that people started to look for alternatives. And Rubinstein in this game played queen c2, which is known as the Capablanca or classical variation, in which you clearly want to take with the queen. There were other more direct approaches, for example a3, which you might think doesn't make sense, but this is the Samish variation, and it doesn't seem to make sense because, hey, Nimzowitsch was taking on c3 willingly. Why waste a tempo on a3? And the key is there's no knight on f3, and we can launch e4, f4 more quickly. Let's say castles, e3, and we're not gonna put the knight on f3, we're gonna put the knight on e2, so we can freely push the pawns. So let's say b6, bishop to f3, d3, sorry, bishop b7, f3, the knight goes to e2, e4, bishop g5, f4. White plays very aggressively, but of course this pawn comes under a lot of pressure quite quickly. So that was a very direct approach, and there were more positional approaches like queen c2, queen b3 was also played at the time, and the idea is to take back with the queen and don't just not destroying our own pawns. Nimzowitsch in this game kept playing as he usually did. d6, e3, c5. He was preparing to take on c3 and close the center, but this can easily go south if you don't get the leverage of the double pawns. Because what you really want to stay away from in the Nimzo are positions where you just give up the bishop pair, white gets a space advantage, and well, black gets nothing to show for the bishop pair. After bishop d3, knight c6, knight to e2, and black makes a mistake. Here he plays c5. Nimzowitsch was just employing his regular idea. The problem is that white is going to get the bishop pair, space advantage after d5, and there are mobile pawns on the board. So black is really going to suffer because white will smother black, while at the same time he will still have mobile pawns to open up diagonals for the two bishops. And it's going to become very uncomfortable very soon. So after some games that went very similarly to this one, people started to realize that when white wastes some time to get the bishop pair, like making moves like queen c2, taking with the queen, black needs to react quickly in the center and try to make up for the bishop pair by means of exploiting their development advantage. For example, black should play kingside castle, and after a3, yeah, white is getting the bishop pair, but look at how many moves he employed. He played a3, queen c2, and he took on c3 with the queen, which at the same time is kind of its post. So yeah, he gets the bishop pair, and granted, if black doesn't do anything and he just develops slowly and normally, white is gonna have the upper hand. But if black reacts quickly with, for example, a couple of trades in center and d5, trying to exchange these two and leave white with an isolated pawn on d4, or jump into e4, or after c5, for example, break on e5, black is definitely getting some play before white castles and completes development. And that's the general idea against these attempts where white spends a lot of time to get the bishop pair. Nimzowitsch didn't quite understand this, which is obvious. I mean, in some later games he started playing with d5 and some more dynamic approaches. But here he goes for his usual setup and it backfires badly. After d5, he takes on c3, because if white takes with the natural way, then what happens is that after knight b4, there's a fork, and that's bye-bye to the bishop pair. So, of course, this is not what Rubinstein was looking for. He just takes with the queen, he keeps the integrity of his pawn structure, and doesn't allow the trade of the bishops. So after knight e7, the queen now goes back to c2, and this is a very uncomfortable scenario for black. And this is what's to learn from the perspective of the player with the black pieces in the Nimzo. And here, this is what you want to avoid. White keeping the bishop pair with a space advantage, without double pawns, without black getting any kind of dynamic play to compensate for it before white mobilizes his pieces fully. And it went really south from here. The game is, well, it's quite a classic. We're gonna take a quick look at it. Even though it looks closed, it's not entirely. There are mobile pawns. f4 could happen, e4 and f4 could happen. there are possibilities of pawn breaks on both sides of the board, so it's not really such a close position. For the time being it is, but there's potential to open it up for the bishops. F3, white had no rush, so black decided he was going to play on the queen side, which makes total sense. But still, the space advantage is given lead to white. These moves are in preparation for f4 without allowing any knight g4 and with pressure on e3. So he's just preparing now b3 to take back with the pawn on c4, queen b6, king h2, getting out of the way. We saw that in the other game by Nimzowitsch. A5, rook a b1, b4. Now, well, black's plan is clearly to open the a file for the rooks, but white is playing strongly on the king side and the center. This is kind of annoying because if black does nothing, white will play f5 and then launch all the pawns forwards, and that's going to be a very tough attack to face. But after e takes, the position starts to open up for the bishops. And it's very tough now. If a4, for example, f5 was very annoying. Knight e5, there's bishop g5, and there's nowhere to go for this knight, incredibly. So we're going to destroy those pawns, come to e4 with the knight, attack the pawn f6 on d6, and that's way too much. So instead, knight f8 was played, but that's a pretty lame move. And where's that knight going? And Rubinstein plays this beautiful maneuver. He's just going to reposition this bishop. Now that he managed to play f4 and to force e takes, he wants the newly open diagonal. And, well, black goes back to defend f6, queen f2 to transfer the queen to the king side, and the bishops are just too strong. Knight g6. If a takes b, rook a2, not much is happening really after rook a1. I guess that's the extent of black's counterplay on the queen side. So he's not going in just yet. Knight g6, rook b to d1, and this is a very instructive maneuver too. The bishop on b1 will cover a2, the other bishop will cover a3 and a1. So there are going to be no entry points on the a file. And there you have it. This is exactly what you don't want as an Nimzo-Indian player. Pair of bishops, space advantage, everything going white's way, even though the position was rather blocked. So after a takes, rook a7 was played, presumably to be able to double up at some point, but it's still very, very complex for black to defend here. And this is a very nice move that Rubinstein makes. He trades his wonderful bishop for the useless knight, but this is just a way of converting the advantage. I mean, in chess, sometimes to improve the position, you have to change one advantage for the other, what we call transformation of the advantage. And here, yeah, he's parting with a clearly better minor piece, but the reason is that the knight comes to e4 thanks to that, attacking d6 and leaving this queen basically out of play on h6, which was the only reasonable square from which it could defend d6. Because if queen e7, knight takes e5 with a discovered attack on the queen, and that would be just terrible. So after queen h6, f5, also part of the plan, trying to cut off the queen after f6. d6 would collapse, the king would be extremely weak. So black tried to get some counterplay, but f6 is still there, so rook a6. g4, even the queen is in danger now. g5, queen to h5, bishop e2, trap the queen. So f6 was played. King g3, funnily enough, the king takes care of f4 and h4, so there are no checks. Rook e1, bishop b7, queen e2, and white is just trying to invade on the e file. No, not much to do here. Black tried knight d7 with the idea of putting down d5, which had to be considered, but white had calculated this very well. Knight takes d6, and he's getting in before black can do anything. Attacking the bishop, by the way, so there's really no way other than taking the rook, but then queen e8 check, knight f8, rook e7. The king covers the checks by the queen. e3 is also off limits, so there are no checks for black, and the simple threat is just check on f7, followed by queen takes f8, checkmate. And it's almost impossible to stop black. Tried g6, queen f7, check, king h8, rook to e8, and there's really nothing to be done about rook takes f8. This is a nice last try. What would you do here? Would you just take the rook? Think about it for a second. I'm going to give the answer now. If you take, suddenly black checks on e3 and you can't really get out of the perpetual check. So you have to be very, very careful till the very end. If king g2, there's queen d2, and black is going to keep checking forever. So, of course, he's not falling for this. He played queen takes f6 check instead. And after king g8, queen e6 check. Very nice check, this one. The knight is pinned, so it can't take the queen. The queen covers this square e3, so if king h8, this time we just take the rook. And the pin is still going on, and there's no queen e3, so there are no checks, and black just loses instantly. And black played king g7 instead, but after f6 he resigns because it's the same thing. If king h8, now we just take the rook, and there are no checks for black, so it's pretty hopeless. So you see, Nimzowitsch had a very clear-cut idea when he came up with the Nimzo-Indian. He would trade the bishop on c3, put all the pawns on dark squares, work against those double pawns. And then Rubinstein came up with this idea at some point to, well, not allow the doubling of the pawns. So experience was built this way. Someone would come up with a new idea against this. I'm not claiming that Rubinstein came up with this idea of taking back with the piece on c3, but you see how the understanding of the opening develops as theory advances, and how the classical games really show the way in which the structures are handled, what are the main ideas of the opening. What you can learn from this game, from black's perspective, is that you should definitely acquire some other type of counterplay in the opening if you don't get the double pawns. You can't just go on and play the original Nimzowitsch plan all the time and just double up the pawns and put everything on dark squares. When it fails and you don't get to play against the double pawns, what will happen is sometimes you will just give up the bishop pair, while we'll have a space advantage, better minor pieces, and you will have a very hard position to play. So see how the historical approach just builds up your knowledge of basic strategy in the opening, what you're looking for, how to handle the structures, certain maneuvers. So I really encourage you to do that before you dive in and just try to memorize all the lines you can in the opening. First, take a look at the most important games of the players from the past. If you're gonna play the time man of Sicilian, it makes absolute sense to go to go through time Manov's first, instead of just trying to memorize all the theory. You will learn much more about the typical structures and maneuvers by doing this. I hope you really enjoyed the video and that it was useful. So if you like the content, please subscribe, leave a like, and I will see you in a new video very soon. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.